I'm Cort. I graduated from Briarwood Fellows last year. I live in Birmingham with my wife, Abby. I got married last summer. I was tasked to speak about sustaining faith over a lifetime. I'm 24, so I guess that was qualification enough, they decided. So I'm just going to talk to you about my year out of Fellows. But first, let's get a show of hands. How many of you are job searching right now, or like grad school or whatever, right? Like a lot of you, like it's the worst thing ever, right? It's like super stressful, terrible. I remember like this time last year, whenever somebody would show up to round table and they'd be like, y'all, I'm so blessed, I got my dream job, or like my boyfriend proposed or whatever. And like externally you're like, I'm so happy for you, that's awesome. And then internally you're like, the ugly part of you is like, please go away. Like, I don't want to hear this. I'm glad I'm not the only one who feels that way. It's incredibly difficult to celebrate someone else's victories when you feel like totally stuck. Thankfully, I was the first fellow in my group to have life completely figured out. In November of my fellows year, I was working with a friend on starting a company that I was really excited about. I got engaged to my high school girlfriend. And then on top of that, my fiance, she was offered a job. She was a French major. She was offered a job in France, translating for this nonprofit. And so I was going to finish fellows, get married, and then move to France. So that's like the best plan ever. I pictured my first year of marriage. I was going to be like drinking wine and eating cheese and like wearing tweed blazers around the French countryside. And it was going to be perfect. Like, it was going to be the best thing ever. And I was going to, like, write a novel or something, because that's what you do in the French countryside. So I showed up at round table and just sort of, like, casually mentioned, like, oh, yeah, like, I figured out life at the ripe age of 23. And then sort of mentally and spiritually, I slipped into cruise control. I was ready to move on to the next stage. Fellows is, like, to figure out your life, I thought. And I had just done that. Fellows was just starting, and I had already checked out. We took all those like vocation tests and like personality tests, and I just was like, these are for the unfortunate people who like are directionless. Like, that must be really tough. I'll entertain these just for your whatever. So spring rolled around, and everyone was like stressing out about what they're going to do, and I continued to quietly congratulate myself on being so far ahead of the curve. And then to make a really long story short, like about a year ago in April, my wife's future employer called and like, hey, actually the position's no longer available. And the company that I was starting was like, we were still just starting out, so I was making like barely $0. And so we were like really banking on that salary of hers to get us through the first year. So just weeks away from Fellows ending, weeks away from becoming a husband, my perfect plan was thrown out the window, right? And so I'm like, great, we're going to live in a box. Like, this is going to be awful. I was super stressed. But thankfully, God has ways of reminding us of his goodness and mercy when we need it the most. Right around that time, a bird had made a nest in the flower pot on the front porch of my host family's home. And these, like, adorable baby birds started to hatch. And so each morning, I sort of, like, made a ritual. I would get up, and I'd go check on the birds, and because I'm a pastor's kid who has been to entirely too much Sunday school over the years, I thought of that verse in Matthew 6, like, look at the birds of the air, like, he takes care of them, he'll take care of us. That's so sweet. I thought, how cool. God is using these baby birds to, like, teach me such an important lesson during this really hard time. And so one morning I went out there to check on the birds, and I found that the mother bird had abandoned the baby birds. And over the next few days, I watched them slowly starve to death. So on an intellectual level, I knew that these birds weren't a metaphor, right? Like I'm not 6 years old. I should not read into this. This is just how the world works. Like, that's okay. But on an emotional level and spiritual level, I couldn't help but think, like, are you serious, God? Like, the birds that were, like, teaching me this lesson? Like, bad move on your part. And so as silly as it sounds, I sort of started to subconsciously ask this question that I had never asked before. What if God doesn't like me? Or worse, what if he's just completely indifferent to my existence? Growing up in church, pastor's kid, I had always sort of heard about these kids who go through youth group, right? And then they're super committed and like fired up. And then the moment they're sort of pulled out of the like spiritual hand-holding and like get sent into the real world, they walk away from their faith. I was pretty self-righteous about the fact that I would never be that kid. Like, I'm just not that cautionary tale. But suddenly, I was the young adult who couldn't seem to remember the last time he truly felt God's presence. So I did what I always did when I was confronted with a problem. I prayed about it. Just kidding. I tried to fix it myself. I was newly married. I had no desire to attend church or find like a community to like challenge me or whatever. But I read a lot of books on theology. I was, biblical commentaries. Basically, I did whatever I could to try to think my way back into God's presence. And you can guess how well that worked out. Because my apathy wasn't stemming from a lack of knowledge. Like, I knew all the right answers. I knew the theology. That wasn't the problem. The problem was that when my life was easy and everything was going my way, I forgot that I needed God. I was learning a lot through fellows about the Bible, and I was expanding my knowledge, but I wasn't cultivating a love and desire for God in my heart. I had confused knowing about God with knowing God. I discovered that sort of the happy-clappy summer camp spiritual high faith of my youth didn't provide the deep roots that it needed to survive, let alone sustain me for the rest of my life. The moment life got slightly difficult, my faith started to fall apart. I had no answer to the question of what to do when it feels like God is walking away. And this is a really important question because at some point, we're all going to feel this way. No exceptions. And many of you probably already do or have felt that way. There are times when it feels like you're being held up and sustained by your faith, but some days it feels like it's slipping through your hands like water. During my fellows year, I often talk with Seth, the Briarwood Fellows leader. He's somewhere out there. We talked a lot about the work of philosopher and theologian James K.A. Smith. If you're not familiar with his work, you should just Google it, check him out. He's phenomenal. But his book, Desiring the Kingdom, was one that Seth and I often talked about, and it ended up being the book that sort of helped shake me from this spiritual apathy. It's a fairly academic book, so just to sum up a 400-page book in a sentence, Smith argues that the attitudes and desires of our hearts aren't necessarily shaped by what we learn as much as they're shaped by our habits, which he calls liturgies. So if we're going to be spiritually formed, we don't just need to listen to another sermon. Sermons are good. We should listen to sermons. But we also need to pay attention to our daily habits of worship and life and ask the question, is this making me desire and love the things of God more and more each day? As my apathy set in, I abandoned the spiritual disciplines of participating in a church community and spending time in prayer and studying the Bible, and I thought, well, I don't really feel like doing this right now. Once I start to feel God's presence again, then I'll go back and pick up those habits. So I replaced those good habits with bad habits, like binge watching 6 hours of Gilmore Girls on Netflix. After realizing that I was getting entirely too invested in Rory Gilmore's love life, I thought back to some of the conversations with Seth and decided to recommit to certain spiritual disciplines, even if I didn't feel like it, just to see what happens. I started waking up earlier to pray, and for a few weeks my prayers were, hey God, I don't know if you're there. I mean, I really hope you are, but honestly, I'm not really sure. Or I'd read my Bible, and it was just totally uninspiring and boring and dry. But after a few weeks, things quietly started to shift. I woke up one morning and read a verse about loving our neighbors, and without even realizing it, my mind went back to that verse throughout the day. And I started looking for ways to be a better neighbor to the people in my apartment complex. And that's when I realized an important lesson. This is often how the Holy Spirit works in our lives. This is how God is made present with us day to day. It's not through flashy miracles and doves descending or whatever. It's through these quiet moments where you notice that something in your heart is starting to change. And that can take a really long time, but that's okay. I've often heard that going through the motions is a bad thing. It means you aren't being authentic or it feels fake. But that hasn't been true for me at all. If I waited until I felt like pursuing God to pursue God, I'd be spiritually stagnant for the rest of my life. Going through the motions, especially when I didn't want to, or when I wasn't even sure God was there, has saved my soul countless times. This isn't a one-time fix, obviously. Every day I have to wake up and consciously choose to pursue the things of God. It was the Fellows program that taught me how to do that, even if I didn't know it at the time. And I'm going to close with this quote from theologian Richard Foster. "A farmer is helpless to grow grain. All he can do is provide the right conditions for the growing of grain. He cultivates the ground, he plants the seed, he waters the plants, and then the natural forces of the earth take over, and up comes the grain. This is the way it is with the spiritual disciplines. They are a way of sowing to the Spirit. By themselves, the spiritual disciplines can do nothing. They can only get us to the place where something can be done." Thanks.